For as long as we can see back in history, humankind has derived well-being from burning things. Warmth, light and mobility have all come from burning. And for last 150 years, carbon has been fundamental basis of our prosperity. But today, all of us know that we have to decarbonize. Decarbonize if we don't want to inflict further damage to our planet and to ourselves. And for that, we will need new kind of gasoline, new kind of automobiles, new power plants, and new kinds of power grids. But in reality, with everything that's happening around us, can we really afford to do this? Can we afford to undo everything that we spent hundreds of years building? But surely we can arrest carbonization. Arrest it by bringing some simple changes in how we think, how we live, how we work, and how we play. Essentially, we need to change our behaviors. Let's have a quick look at the emissions from an average Western household. It's very clear that half of the emissions really accrue from motoring. Now, it's very difficult to debate with the convenience of personal mobility that cars offer, but the fact remains that despite the progress we've made in cleaner cars, emissions from transport grew by 28% between 1990 and 2007 across Western world. It's also really not about driving, but responsibility that we show while driving. Fast starts and hard braking, in other words aggressive driving, uses 39% more fuel and produces 5 times more emissions. Poorly maintained vehicles use up to 50% more fuel and 50% more emissions. Similarly, overspeeding or over-idling. We therefore need a new model, a model which supports a low carbon resource efficient economy, a model which incentivizes right behavior, a model where private good of citizen leads to a bigger public good. Because it's very hard to tell someone to spend more money for public good, a model where it must cost less to turn green than not to. Today, I want to introduce a model of differential fuel pricing, where price of fuel is individually tailored to one's driving behavior. This is how.
The MO solution consists of an onboard unit, an emission reader, and a back-end central repository. The onboard unit captures and stores information on the exhaust levels of various emissions from the vehicle in real time. Records of vehicle details and identification are also maintained in the onboard unit, which can be used along with the emission detail records. As the vehicle approaches a fuel station, the emission reader at the fuel station uses its RF capability to pick up the data from the onboard unit of the vehicle. The emission record is then analyzed and the back-end system calculates a fuel price based on the emission levels of the vehicle. If the vehicle is greener, the fuel price is lower. If the vehicle's pollution levels are higher, then the fuel price to the customer goes up. All this is achieved with absolutely no inconvenience to the customer, as he just drives into a fuel station and fills gas just like before. MO's innovative solution of differential pricing sensitizes vehicle drivers to real-life implications of emission levels, while also providing them with an incentive to reduce emission levels by maintaining their vehicles in good health and driving sensibly.
It's this little device which you simply plug in a port normally below the steering wheel, which acts as a bridge between your car and the fuel station via a cloud. This also gives you an audible beep as a feedback which helps you improve your driving. The idea of using price to regulate people's behavior has been in use for very long. A big component of fuel price is fuel tax, which forms up to 60% of the price. It's this tax which needs to become differential and should vary based on driving behavior. Differential fuel tax has been used in past. It's been used in past to deter people from using leaded gasoline, which was the major source of lead in the atmosphere in the 80s. Now, this policy has been so successful that lead emissions from transportation have been cut to practically zero. A country equipped for the future should also have a very modern tax system that should be used to send critical signals about the behavior it wants to promote and deter. One could argue that we could impose one-time tax on inefficient cars, but one-time tax does not alter long-term behavior. Research shows that as cars become more expensive, they become even more desirable. And regulators have been telling us that when you go to the fuel pump and you have a car in front of you or behind you paying less price for the same fuel, then irrespective of how much money you may have in your bank, it starts impacting your mind. And over time, you start changing your behavior, and so does a child sitting next to you in the car. In real life deployments across Germany, across France, and across Portugal, even though the incentive doesn't yet come from differential fuel pricing, organizations and governments are saving significant amount of fuel, money, and emissions. Let me show you how Galp, the Portuguese oil major, was able to do it. I will use the same chart that was made famous by Hans Rosling in his landmark TED speech. Each of the bubbles in this graph is a driver. When we started the project, their position was in the top left-hand corner of the graph, meaning that they had a high carbon emissions and poor driving behavior. Now, after deployment of these devices and over time, drivers began changing their driving habits to be more eco-friendly. Their carbon emissions started to go down. Now, this can be seen by the movement to the bottom right-hand side of the graph, indicating improved performance. However, some, and in particular these two drivers, Dwight and Brett, were not able to do as well as the rest. To understand why, let's go back in time. And this time, let's look if aggressive driving parameter was the cause. So I choose the parameter here and replay. The size of the bubble means more aggressive driving and consequently higher emissions. Now, as we can see, both Dwight and Brett are very aggressive in their driving as their bubbles just keep growing. Aggressive driving, of course, wastes fuel and increases emissions, and that was clearly the reason for their poor performance. I would leave you with this thought that when deployed globally, this model has potential to save oil equal to 60 million tankers of oil every year, which amounts to 500 million tons of carbon or 1 billion barrels of oil annually. But more than that, and more importantly, it helps us leave behind a better planet for our children.